Bom, boa tarde, bem-vindos à sala Zoom do TBA, para a segunda de duas lições sobre logística. Eu vou mais ou menos dizer a mesma introdução de ontem, para quem não esteve ontem na sessão. Portanto, bem-vindos. Esta é a segunda de duas lições sobre logística, entendida de um modo crítico, como fundamental para compreender os processos contemporâneos da organização do trabalho, produção, distribuição e consumo. Processos estes que a corrente pandemia, com a necessidade de paragem que a interrupção da circulação do vírus acarreta, veio de algum modo, em maior ou menor grau, curto-circuitar, tornando porventura mais evidentes. Ou como vimos ontem, num primeiro momento houve um bloqueio e num segundo momento houve uma reconfiguração, por assim dizer. Como eu expliquei ontem, a ideia destas duas lições apareceu em maio, quando logo após o primeiro confinamento de março-abril, em que apenas os trabalhadores ditos essenciais estavam autorizados a circular, houve um grande surto de Covid na plataforma logística da Azambuja. E de repente, um local de bastidores, ponto nodal da área metropolitana de Lisboa, mas também da distribuição da zona centro-sul do país, foi durante um breve período iluminado pelas notícias que davam a ver armazéns, contentores, paletes, linhas de armazenamento, carrinhos de distribuição, mas sobretudo trabalhadores migrantes. Uma imagem que eu posso mandar de seguida, que é claríssima, em que se vêem trabalhadores negros, marroquinos e indianos a passar a linha de comboio da Zambuja. A imbricação entre a deslocação das coisas e a circulação das pessoas, e com elas do vírus, e certas lógicas da produção de um espaço heterogéneo são evidentes. E este é o terreno no qual o trabalho de Sandro Mezzadra é ímpar, pelo que me pareceu um excelente pretexto para este convite que eu vinha há algum tempo a pensar em fazer. Trata-se não de uma conferência, mas são duas lições. O Sandro Mezzadra é professor também. Serão em inglês e visam especificamente sobre logística crítica, tema pouco abordado em Portugal e que me parece merecedor de destaque. Estas lições vão ser gravadas, ficando disponíveis. Portanto, queria avisar toda a gente que está a ser gravado. Há um texto de apoio com indicações bibliográficas e sugestão de autores que foi traduzido e tornado acessível na página do TBA, penso que já distribuímos. Vai sair amanhã uma entrevista no Jornal Y, uma entrevista a Sandro Mesada por António Guerreiro, e gostávamos que no final haja espaço para conversa, debate e questões. Podem colocar as vossas questões de duas maneiras, ou por chat, usando a ferramenta Q&A, escrevendo, ou então usando a opção de levantar a mão e é-vos ativado o som e podem colocar a questão oralmente. Para além disso, eu convidei os investigadores Franco Tomassoni e Andrea Pavoni, que estão a organizar o primeiro livro sobre logística crítica editado no país, com o prefácio de Sandro Mezzadra e edição da cooperativa Outro Módulo, Le Monde Diplomatique, para estarem connosco no diálogo final, numa sessão que eu repito será aberta. A sessão de ontem introduziu algumas noções básicas a autores, genealogia, história e atuais desenvolvimentos críticos do campo da logística, e esta de hoje centrar-se-á mais na apresentação de exemplos de lutas sociais e laborais atualmente em curso, terminando com uma discussão sobre capitalismo de plataforma na sua relação com a logística. Eu penso que isto é de particular interesse neste momento em que a Amazon, Uber e uma série de plataformas deste género são cada vez mais importantes. Por último, vou apresentar Sandro Mezzadra, que é professor na Universidade de Bolonha. Os seus estudos concentram-se na história das ideias políticas e na teoria política. Nos últimos anos tem trabalhado sobre a relação entre globalização, migração e cidadania, teoria pós-colonial, capitalismo contemporâneo, operaísmo e autonomismo italiano. So, Sandro, I will maybe ask you to very, very briefly to at least tell us a little bit what was yesterday's lesson so that we can jump
Sure.
into today's lesson. Thank
Sure.
you so much
Thank you.
again for being here.
Thank you very much, Anna. Yesterday, I was speaking of logistics in general. I started with kind of very simple definition of logistics, and then I spoke a bit about the history of modern logistics, emphasizing military origins on the one hand and colonial origins on the other hand. More generally, this genealogy has important implications also for the present, because logistics oscillates between a military rationality and, let's say, a civil, an economic, a business rationality. In my class yesterday, I dwelled on the so-called logistics revolution in the 1960s and 1970s. And I explained that the logistics revolution produced a completely new mobility paradigm. I emphasized that the logistics revolution became practically effective in the early 1970s, which means in a moment in which capitalism was undergoing a deep crisis. We know that capitalism was able to overcome that crisis through a dramatic reorganization of its working, its geography, its rationality. Usually this dramatic reorganization is connected with the start of the neoliberal hegemony. Logistics is part and parcel of this turmoil and this transition. It is, in a way, to be considered together with neoliberalism. But as I was explaining yesterday, it also opens up an interesting angle on neoliberalism, because logistics play a crucial role in constructing the spaces of the world market, the spaces of trade, through the global stretching of supply chains that enabled the outsourcing of industrial activities toward the so-called global south. That was a very important feature of the general reorganization of capitalism that I was mentioning before. So the shipping container on the one hand and the notion of supply chain on the other hand are very important in order to understand logistics and to understand the very revolution, particularly in the organizing of economic spaces brought about by the so-called logistics revolution. I was also emphasizing that the new mobility paradigm connected to the logistics revolution brought about a reshuffling of the relations between production, distribution, and circulation. And I dwelled quite at length on this reshuffling, in particular speaking of the operations of inventory giants like Walmart and Amazon. Before turning to digital platforms and the platform capitalism, which will be the main topic of today's class, let me add a couple of words regarding a topic that we discussed yesterday after my talk. logistics produces its own spaces. I was emphasizing the fact that the logistical production of space is a capitalist production of space. And I was also contending that nowadays we are confronted with powerful tensions and conflicts between spaces of capital, in particular logistical spaces, and political spaces. I was saying that such tensions, gaps, conflicts provide us with a very effective angle on making and unmaking of the word order and disorder, which is a topic that I consider, of course, particularly important in the current conjuncture. From a theoretical point of view, there are many ways to come to grips with such a predicament. We could, for instance, speak of tensions, gaps, conflicts between capitalism and territorialism, using a notion that figures prominently in the research agenda of world system theory. We could speak of tensions and even conflicts between geopolitical spaces and geoeconomic spaces. In a way, all these notions can be helpful. But I think that logistics allows us to add something very important, which means that nowadays spaces of capital as logistical spaces cannot be reduced to economic spaces. There is something more at work in those spaces. There is something more from the angle of the government of territories and people, which means from the angle of politics. It is too easy to make a kind of opposition between geopolitical spaces as political spaces and spaces of capital as economic spaces. Spaces of capital today, precisely because they are mainly logistical spaces, are also political spaces. Logistical spaces like zones, corridors, and hubs produce their own governmental regimes and deploy deeply political effects. Speaking of infrastructures, Keller Easterling introduces the notion of extra statecraft. And this is a notion that I find very helpful in order to grasp what is at stake in the logistical production of spaces. And what is at stake is the blurring of the boundary between politics and economics, to put it simply. We will see more regarding this important point today, speaking of platforms. Last point regarding logistics. I want to emphasize that logistics is not neutral. It is rather a site of contention, of conflict, of clash. And this is confirmed by the dramatic development of social and labor struggles surrounding logistics, from sabotage of infrastructures to counter-logistical experiments, as the ones I was mentioning yesterday, speaking of platform cooperativism. And then you have very innovative labor struggles in logistics. Labor struggles in logistics, be it in ports or in the so-called gig economy, are innovative precisely because logistics prompts innovations in the organization of labor and radically disrupts established statuses and rights. So the new frontiers of logistical development essentially associated with the processes of digitalization enable and shape new forms of organization of labor. Blur the distinction between life and work within the dystopic frame of a 24/7 productivity regime, spur the working of high-frequency trading on global financial markets, as well as the emergence of app-driven sharing and quote-unquote gig economies, and transform urban spaces and styles of life. Yesterday, we spoke about culture and logistics. As we will see more in detail today, platform capitalism is enabled, driven, and shaped by logistics and its delivery rationality. And there is a need to stress that platforms are definitely among the winners of the current crisis. They will stay with us. Platforms further expanded during the pandemic crisis their grip on social relations, while the link between platforms and financialization has been further entrenched. Just think of a platform like Zoom, the one we are using right now. 1 year ago, only few people, at least in Europe, were familiar with Zoom. But now it's part and parcel of the everyday life of millions of people. And in 3 months, the stock exchange value of Zoom has grown 5 times. I could speak of Airbnb in this respect. Many people were thinking, okay, platforms will be among the winners of the current crisis, but not all platforms. For instance, not Airbnb, because Airbnb core business is mobility, is tourism. Well, Airbnb was able to get a spectacular increase in its last month. It's is something we should reflect upon. Such situation makes an investigation of platform capitalism even more urgent. So platform capitalism. Platform capitalism is a phrase that is often used in a quite loose way, referring to the business model of firms that operate in the web, from Netflix to Google and Facebook, as well as to such platforms as Uber and Airbnb that subsume and organize in a capitalist way, under the logic of profit, the principles of the so-called sharing economy. So I will base my discussion of platform capitalism on a book by Nick Zrnicek entitled The Platform Capitalism. I will write in the chat the names of the authors that I will mention tonight.
Thank you.
Okay. It's right. But first of all, let me state a principle of method for the analysis of platform capitalism and platform labor. Of course, we look at platform capitalism because it is important in itself. But also because the trends and standards of its development have an impact on capitalism writ large, which means on life. So, of course, when we speak of platform capitalism, we primarily look, for instance, at platform workers like the riders working for delivery, food delivery platforms. But we don't look only at the riders. We also look at social labor in general from the angle of the impact of platform capitalism on the condition of a multitude of workers and even citizens who do not appear to be directly linked with the platform. The notion of platform labor is a very important notion for the analysis of platform capitalism. But it is important to note that scholars working on platform capitalism also use another notion, which means the notion of platformization of labor. You see the double movement. On the one hand, the riders. On the other hand, for instance, workers in the garment industry in Southwest China, whose conditions of work and life have been radically disrupted by the operation of e-commerce platforms. Platform capitalism is part and parcel of what is usually called Industry 4.0 or Industrial Revolution 4.0. So it is strictly connected with the use of artificial intelligence in the realm of production, in the economic realm. As you definitely all know, the soul of each platform is an algorithm. A second important question has to do with, let's say, the geography of platform capitalism and platform labor. Just think of other disruptive innovations in the history of capitalism. Just think of Taylorism and Fordism, to make an easy example. Which was the geography of Taylorism and Fordism? First of all, in the United States of America, which means in the hegemonic country. Then in Western Europe. And only with a significant delay in other parts of the world. Look now at the geography of platform capitalism and platform labor. Platform capitalism and platform labor today are everywhere in the world. In Latin America, in Asia, in many African metropolises. And there are many places in the world where we are confronted with the emergence of, let's say, indigenous platforms, like Alibaba or Tencent in China, but also in Russia, in India, you have quote and unquote indigenous platforms. But what interests me is the fact that platform capitalism and platform labor are everywhere in the world. This does not mean that differences and hierarchies are erased. The opposite is the case. But, you know, I recently had the opportunity to participate in workshops with Latin American friends and colleagues, with Chinese friends and colleagues, speaking of platform labor, and we were all speaking of the same object, using the same language, which would not have been possible, for instance, at the time of the emergence and consolidation of Fordism. This has important implications also for social struggles, labor struggles, and labor organizing. The spread of platform labor, an instance of the wider notion of digital labor, further accelerates processes of casualization and fragmentation of labor that are underway in many parts of the world. They further accelerate what I call the explosion of the standard labor relation. And we can talk about that in the discussion if you are interested. But there are struggles. There are powerful struggles that resist such processes. And I think it is very significant that on October 8, 2020, a couple of months ago, there was a global strike of riders that was called by Latin American riders. So as I was explaining before, the development of platform capitalism is part and parcel of the expansion of the frontiers of logistics. This is clear regarding platforms operating in the transport sector, like for instance Uber, in the delivery sector, like for instance Deliveroo or Just Eat, or in labor brokerage, like for instance TaskRabbit, basically in the US. But the very soul of platforms, as I was calling it before, which means the algorithm, is to be understood as a development of the main principles of the logistics revolution in the 1960s and 1970s. And it is also clear, as I will show, regarding the very form of the platform, its rationality of intermediation. If you look at the form of the platform, there is a clear continuity with the development of logistics. Platform capitalism, as we know it today, emerged in the framework of the financial crisis of 2007 and 2008, and particularly in the framework of the generalized low interest rate environment in the wake of the crisis, which has reduced the rate of return on a wide range of financial assets and has prompted investors, venture capitalists, to turn to increasingly risky assets like platforms. It is in this environment that the platforms emerged as a new kind of business model. Let me read a short passage from the book by Nick Zrnicek. Platforms are a new type of firm. They are characterized by providing the infrastructure to intermediate between different user groups, by displaying monopoly tendencies driven by network effects, by employing cross-subsidization to draw in different user groups, and by having a designed core architecture that governs the interaction possibilities. What I find particularly important in this passage are 2 points. The first one is the emphasis on the intermediation as a core business of platforms. Intermediation, interaction. The second point has to do with monopoly tendencies that characterize the operations of platforms. Insofar as platforms organize the intermediation between different user groups, between different people, they subsume such groups under their operations. and they tend to monopolize the possibility of intermediation. Zirnicek distinguishes 5 different types of platforms. There are many platforms. He speaks of advertising platforms, of cloud platforms, industrial platforms, product platforms, and the lean platforms. I will not go into the detail of this typology. Suffice it to say that all platforms work with what Zirnicek calls a new raw material, a completely new raw material, which means data. Yesterday, I already pointed to the relevance of data, but today data will be at the very center of the class and hopefully of the ensuing discussion. Focusing on this new raw material leads to a stress on the extractive nature of the operations of platforms. Platforms work with a new raw material. This new raw material has to be extracted, first of all. And this emphasis on the extractive nature of the operations of platforms resonates with what I was saying yesterday, speaking of Amazon and Walmart. There is a wide consensus in platform studies on the relevance of extraction, on the relevance of what is significantly called data mining. Data mining. And we should consider data to be the raw material that must be extracted. And which is the source of this new raw material? The activities of users are the natural source of this new raw material, which means of data. And just like oil, as Zirnicek writes, data are a material to be extracted, refined, and used in a variety of ways. And the more data one has, the more uses one can make of them. That's, again, an important point. There is a kind of compulsion to appropriate data at the heart of the operations of platforms. To appropriate data. What does this mean? Let's keep the question open for now. But we are confronted here with a crucial question for a theory of platform capitalism, and more generally for a theory of contemporary capitalism. And the question is, what is the source of value in platform capitalism? Where does the valorization of capital invested in platforms come from? So let's say, first of all, that each platform has and exploits its own workers. usually precarious workers who are not directly employed by platforms. So there is a moment of exploitation in the very traditional sense of the concept at the heart of the valorization of platform capital. And these workers play a crucial role in the valorization of capital. But alongside the labor, we have a second source of value, which means precisely data. And data are collectively produced by each and all of us. They are produced by social cooperation, and they can be defined as a common good. So from this point of view, there is a moment of dispossession. Maybe some of you are familiar with the debate on the difference between exploitation and dispossession, a debate that was initiated several years ago by David Harvey. Well, in platform capitalism, you can see exploitation and dispossession working in tandem and articulated. So there is a kind of double source of value at the origin of processes of valorization of capital invested in platforms. I will come back to this question of data at the end of my talk today, but let me add something more about what I was calling before the platform form, the very form of the platform. To do that, I would like to discuss with you the definition of platform provided by Benjamin Bratton in his book, The Stack of Sovereignty and Software. Quite a nice title. Let me write the name. And what I find interesting in Bratton's work is that he stresses the political effects of the operations of platforms. And you will understand that this point for me is particularly important since I was speaking of the political effects of the logistical production of space before. Bratton emphasizes that platforms tend to absorb functions of the state and the work of government, foreshadowing what he calls a specific kind of platform sovereignty. Platforms are, according to Bratton, I quote, generative mechanisms, engines that set the terms of participation according to fixed protocols, example given technical, discursive, formal protocols, but gain size and strength by mediating unplanned and even unplannable interactions. You see again the moment of intermediation and the moment of growth, the moment of compulsive growth. It is easy to see that from this point of view, the platform is an eminently governmental device, which enables what we can call with Michel Foucault, a conduct of conduct, characterized by the management of multiplicity and differences according to a flexible and selective modality. Again, the boundary between politics and economics appears blurred. So to conclude, let me speak of one more book, a very successful book. I guess it can be published also in Portuguese. The name of the author, a legal theorist, is Shoshana Zuboff, and the title of the book is Surveillance Capital, Data Surveillance. This is a very interesting book because it critically looks at the question of the connection between data and surveillance from the point of view of the economic operations of platforms. An important notion introduced in the debate by Shoshana Zuboff is the notion of behavioral surplus. And she forges this notion with Marx's notion of surplus value in mind. So behavioral surplus, what does it mean? Zuboff refers to this notion to the excess of collected data on individual behavior over what is needed for a specific requested service. Say a search on Google, buying a book on Amazon, or requesting a ride on Uber. All these services request data. But Zuboff shows that what really matters from the point of view of platforms, and she focuses particularly on Google, is not the information needed for the service. It is rather the excess of information that the user exchanges with the platform while requesting that service. It is precisely this excess, this surplus, what matters for digital companies and platforms. And it enables limitless processes of valorization, as well as the elaboration of predictive patterns that anticipate and steer future behavior. In this sense, as you see, surveillance is at the heart of contemporary capitalism, disrupting in a way the very liberal notion of privacy. So let me conclude as announced by harking back to the question of data as the crucial raw material for the operation of digital platforms. Let's take again Shoshana Zuboff's book. Instead of labor, she writes, surveillance capitalism feeds on every aspect of every human experience. Surveillance capitalism does not focus only on labor. It rather feeds on every aspect of every human's experience. Again, the question, what are data? Data concern precisely every aspect of every human's experience. So this is an interesting statement which raises again the problem that I discussed with respect to the source of value of platform capital. I will maintain my point that labor continues to play an important role in this respect. Although I agree with Zuboff that it cannot be considered the only source of value. Data, remember, data which are capturing every aspect of every human's experience is a crucial second source of valorization for digital companies and platforms. We encountered here a fundamental question that we have already discussed. How do we find the human activity that generates data? So if data are so important as a source for the valorization of platform capital, we have to ask, where do data come? How can we define the human activity that generates data? There is a kind of lively debate on this point in critical platform studies. There are some scholars like Tiziana Terranova, for instance, who work in, let me write, who work in the tradition along the lines of Italian autonomous Marxism, who say the activity, the human activity that generates data is labor, and more precisely, it is free labor, a labor without a wage. As far as Zuboff is concerned, she writes that we are the sources of surveillance capitalism's crucial surplus. We are the sources of surveillance capitalism's crucial surplus. The objects of a technologically advanced and increasingly inescapable raw material extraction cooperation. Wernicek, that I was discussing before, contends, on the contrary, that data have value but do not generate surplus value, being simply a raw material. I must say that as far as I am concerned, I do not agree with this point. Maybe we need a different kind of conceptual language in order to define the human activity that generates data. Defining it in a straightforward way as labor, even if free labor, can be misleading, because when we work, when we order a book on Amazon, when we post an image on Facebook, we don't have the impression to be working, but we do contribute to the generation of data, which means to the generation of value and surplus value. Moreover, it does not convince me to say that data are simply a raw material. It's okay, but the point is that contrary to minerals or oil, data as a raw material are socially produced. And we have to look at the way in which this social production develops. We have to look at the moments of antagonism, at least of potential antagonism that shape, crisscross that social production of data. But independently on how we describe the activity that generates data, the struggle for taking back control of data and for an economic reward of our activity is a key terrain of mobilization and action in contemporary capitalism. The question of basic income is often discussed in this regard, although there is a need to remember that some years ago, even Mark Zuckerberg was supporting a form of basic income. I think that what is also particularly interesting is to reflect upon the connection and articulation between the struggle to take back control of data and labor struggles like the struggles of the riders. This was it.
Okay, thank you so much, Sandro. Well, a lot of things here. Se alguém quiser fazer questões, eu agradeço que as escrevam aqui onde diz Q&A ou que levantem a mão e nós damos voz. Alguém do teatro. E, so, Franco and Andrea, pedia-vos talvez que ligassem as câmaras, se for possível. E pronto, penso que podemos começar uma conversa. So, Sandro, I was thinking while I was listening to you that maybe I would try to, as we are in a theater room, although it doesn't look like it, but we do. I thought that maybe simple way or a way of putting it more simple would be to try to look at some of the aesthetics of logistics. So I would think I'm thinking of you've spoken about different figures, very important, like containers, harbors, logistical platforms such as the one I mentioned at the beginning. Yesterday we've spoken about greenhouses and new forms of agriculture until we arrive to digital platforms. So I would maybe ask you to go speak a little bit of these different figures because they are all connected and in somehow they help us to see that the space is not fluid and it's not as easy as I order something and this thing arrives to my house. So there are all these points and all these figures of logistics that that preceded. Another thing I think it's really important, I'm thinking for instance of the greenhouses in Alentejo, which have a lot of Thai workers from Thailand working there. So it's this heterogeneous composition of labor that often this new figure or these figures of this new logistical moment we are currently living I'm interested in particular in this because you have both circulation of people coming from Thailand and an industrialization of agriculture in a big area in Portugal. So this is it. Before we go to data, then I have a question on data and all that, but maybe let's just stop again in these different figures, harbors, containers, digital platforms, workers. So this is it. Finally, I have one question on data, and maybe I would ask you to give us, help us a bit with this idea of excess of information. So I'm thinking, for instance, is it something like I order something online and it's like where, at what time, what else was I looking before? So all these other things I've made before online that generate data. So I'm trying to put it more concrete. So this is the idea, is like to give concrete examples of what you're saying so that people can relate. I think this is what I'm trying to do here. I don't know, Franco and Andrea, do you have already any question?
I may just add I really appreciate what Sandro did with respect to, I mean, this critique to this idea of what is at times a bit of a kind of cumbersome, a bit over structuralistic idea about data. Data is labor, which I find it always a bit problematic because, I mean, I think that data, first of all, we need to define data, of course. Second, of course, probably there are not even raw data because, of course, data are always the result of a process of what in informatics is called granularization, which is a way in which data are made available to appropriation. I mean, the computation, digital computation cannot act on reality, but always have to granularize reality to make it palatable to. So there is always this process of filtering reality in a way. But anyway, what I found always problematic with this attempt to reduce every data to a kind of labor, and then every process of, as you put it, giving data to a process of giving something that then is valorized, is the fact that actually we constantly give data also as a simple matter of our own benefit in every kind of transaction, even before the digital era. I mean, of course, we provide data to a kind of, we can say Amazon. Yeah, we provide data to Amazon, and part of this data are, of course, used by Amazon, and of course, Amazon is the most problematic case, but there can be other cases. It's used in order to provide us with the service we are asking. Now, while in this process, there is always a process of valorization, etc., there is also a process which is unavoidably based on the fact that we need to provide some kind of data in order to enter a transaction. And I'm not talking just about, reducing this process to just a kind of exploitation, maybe it's a bit problematic. And when I say reducing, I say, of course, I'm not pointing that there is not such a process. So in a way, what I'm trying to point to is to what extent an approach, which to some extent, the one of Shoshana Zuboff, an approach which take from an implicit starting point, what you mentioned, a liberal notion of privacy, in which any kind of penetration within our own sphere is perceived as something by definition problematic. To what extent is useful? My point of view, which is not a way to give an answer in advance, but just to provide my point of view, is that rather than an approach we take for granted that separation between private sphere and public sphere, in which every kind of penetration is seen as problematic, and then extraction, and then exploitation, probably is more about trying to see the use of data and the way in which the use of data creates impairment to the flourishing, to use a very general term, to the flourishing of my social, professional, sentimental, etc., life can be problematic. So this is just a kind of question that to wrap up, to what extent a kind of, even implicit, because of course a lot of, it's not necessarily Shoshana Zuboff or other authors, not necessarily by explicitly in a kind of liberal understanding of privacy, but even implicitly, to what extent challenging surveillance capitalism and data extraction from an implicit liberal understanding of what is the private sphere is useful or maybe problematic. This is my question.
Should I reply?
Yes, yes. I think it's maybe now.
Okay. Okay. Thank you very much for these two sets of questions. I think it is very important to reflect upon modes and practices of visualization of logistics in general and the platforms in particular. You know, if I were to suggest a very simple way to visualize the extractive dimension of digital platforms, I would suggest to combine images of digital platforms with images of oil extraction platforms. Until the 1990s, the most common way to use the notion of a platform with respect to economy was speaking of oil extraction platforms, offshore platforms. And I think that this kind of visualization could be very effective precisely because it combines realities that seem so far away from each other. And then greenhouses, you know, there are many attempts to grasp and visualize the kind of logistical transformation of agriculture that was also mentioned yesterday, and the processes of heterogenization of labor, of migrant labor, to put it quickly, that are connected with the logistical transformation of agriculture. And then if I think of containers, there is a wonderful work that comes to my mind, which means The Forgotten Space by Alan Sekula. If you don't know that work, I mean, it's really amazing. It's really amazing precisely because it manages to combine the representation of a crucial logistical space with the heterogeneous forms of labor that enable the very existence of that space. Let me write also.
I think I was putting this. I was asking you all this because yesterday someone from the theater was asking me all this like in aesthetic ways, and I think that one of the ideas of this theater, which is focused on experimentation and the contemporary, trying to understand, is this precisely this capacity to look at what is out there. And I think even in the urban space of the city, suddenly you can, if you look at it, you can see a lot of heterogeneous forms of labor. And I'm thinking, for instance, from Uber and to Glovo delivery people, or people delivering it in bikes, to for instance, to a lot of Bangladeshi stores where you don't even know how, in which labor conditions do all these people and work. And this is it's out there. And I think usually people don't look at it as
I understand. That's a very important point. If I think of Bologna, for instance, there are a lot of migrant workers that work as riders for Just Eat, Deliveroo, and other digital platforms, particularly food delivery platforms. And at the same time, in Bologna, the Bangladeshi community manages many groceries, and so you can trace the relation between such completely different spaces and let's say, quote unquote, forms of life. And it is interesting because, if you think of a digital platform, what you immediately visualize is hypermodernity. And then you have these, again, quote unquote, very traditional forms of life, styles of life, that nevertheless are structurally connected with the hypermodernity of the platform. That's a very tricky but also important point. Now I describe it with the language of modernity and tradition, but I could also employ a different language, which means the Marxian distinction between real substantiation and formal substantiation, where real substantiation is usually considered the most advanced form of capital's command, while formal substantiation is in a way kind of archaic form. I was speaking before of platformization of labor. I was saying what matters is not only platform labor, is also the wider process of platformization of labor, which means the impact of platform capitalism on the world of labor as such.
Let me just read you here. We have we have here Tatiana from Brazil, and she says, "I'm studying logistic infrastructure inside the Brazilian Amazon, particularly a small town named Itaituba, which turned into an offshore platform. So I want to thank you all for this conversation. I think it resonates with what you're saying, and I will let you continue."
Thank you, Tatiana. No, I was just saying something very, very quick. A couple of weeks ago, I was reading a paper on the impact of e-commerce platforms on the garment industry in southwest China. And this paper shows in a very effective way that the penetration of e-commerce platforms completely changed the organization of labor in the garment industry, and it created the conditions for the re-emergence of presumably ancient forms of organization of labor, like the domestic workshops. So this connection again between a seemingly archaic element and a seemingly hyper-modern element is very important. Also from a cultural point of view. Okay, then there were questions on data, and I must say that I completely agree with Andrea. We don't have to demonize digital platforms for the extraction of data. Every day we give data, give information, and we are happy to do so, even with platforms. And platforms are providing us with services that we like, and that would be impossible without the data, the information that we give them. The problem, to put it quickly, is another one. The problem is that platforms, some platforms more than others, build upon the extraction of data gigantic processes of accumulation. There is a disproportion between the kind of services that we have from platforms and the unbelievable concentration, accumulation and concentration of wealth that platforms prompt. That's the point that I find politically problematic. I also very much agree on Andrea's comments on the question of privacy, also with respect to Shoshana Zuboff. And yes, the point is that platforms, let's say, blur the boundary between private and public. I insisted in my class today that platforms blur the boundary between the economy and politics, which means that they blur the boundary also between private and the public. Let's think of a space like Facebook, for instance. Is it possible to define that space as a private space? I don't think this is the case. And nevertheless, there is a problem. And the problem has to do with ownership, with private property. So we could say that Facebook space is an hybrid space. It is neither public nor private, but the rule of private property matters a lot in Facebook. It matters because of the accumulation of wealth that I was just mentioning, but it also matters from the point of view of the rules, from the point of view of the regulation of that space. So you will all have followed the heated debate on Twitter and Facebook versus Donald Trump. And okay, I guess you imagine that I'm not a fan of Donald Trump. Nevertheless, I ask myself whether it makes sense that it is a private power that can decide about the right to speak of Donald Trump, which means of us, because because we are also subjected to that arbitrary private power. Robert, the question of privacy, the question of the blurred boundary between economy and politics has also other implications. Just think of the use of data to manipulate electoral processes. That's another problem we are familiar with. The Cambridge Analytica scandal telling in this respect. But this is just to say that it is a big question, but it's really a crucial question for our life, for our social, cultural, political life.
I don't know if we have more questions. If not, maybe I would ask you to go a little bit longer on domestic labor and maybe the pandemics. So on domestic labor and logistics, and then domestic labor and the current moment we are facing in now.
The question raises the problem of the relation between digital platforms and social reproduction. Kind of relevant aspects in the operations of platforms that have an impact on social reproduction. And domestic labor is, of course, very important in this respect. There are several platforms for the intermediation of domestic and care labor. One of those platforms that operate in Europe is Helpling. But if you go to the United States, you will find plenty of apps and platforms for the intermediation of domestic labor. What is interesting is that there are also several cooperative platforms established and self-managed by domestic workers, and that are very effectively in laying the basis for a more favorable negotiation between workers and employers.
I think I was not clear. Maybe I didn't use the right expression. Of course, I'm interested in domestic labor, but I was meant to say working from home. This was everybody. This was what I was meant.
Domestic labor, I was
not domestic labor. Yes, and
it's not the right.
But I think you touch upon this question of social reproduction, which I think is very important.
Yeah, of course. Of course, because
and then we have a question here on Q&A, which have more to do with what you were saying previously. So that maybe I don't know in which order you would like to continue asking now. To this.
No, I say something more about teleworking, smart working, kind of transformation of the home into a workplace, you know. And this is something that, of course, has a huge impact on the sexual division of labor within the home. And I'd say that in the pandemic, and particularly during lockdowns, the home became even more than usually a site of conflict, a site of negotiation, a site of conflict. The spread of teleworking is also here to stay. You know, the pandemic, from this point of view, represents a moment of acceleration of already existing processes, and our lives after the pandemic will be more and more shaped by teleworking and by the transformation of the home into a work place. In Italy, but also in other countries, for instance, in Latin America, I guess also in other European countries, but I didn't read anything about those. There was a huge increase of violence against women in the last year. And I would say that this is connected with the transformation of the home into an internal border. Particularly during lockdowns, the proliferation of borders within national spaces had its moment of crowning the transformation of the home itself into a border.
Precisely, with all this, all the infrastructure and everything you need to work from should be yours, so it should be personal. It should be owned by you, and etc. With all, but let's go for this question. So, should the states blur geopolitics borders in order to regulate and get a better understanding and legislation about platform capitalism? So, this question by Felipe Santos. Then you have David Escarso. I found the observation of the difficulty of categorizing data either as raw material or as labor very interesting and productive. Would you agree that part of that difficulty is due to the fact that data and data access is produced in activities in which we believe to be free? So it's free labor because it's not paid, but also because there is no obligation to post on Facebook, to use Uber or WhatsApp. And platforms are even perceived as enhancing our freedom. Thank you. Thank you both.
Yeah, thank you both. So to the question of Felipe, you know, blurring the geopolitical borders means for me to move toward a transnational approach to the questions that we are discussing. And to put it very simply, I don't think that Italy or Portugal would have any chance to regulate platform capitalism. Maybe at the European level, this is possible. It is possible at least to experiment in a more effective way with such a difficult question as the regulation of platforms. We have to be clear. This is a very difficult exercise from the point of view of fiscal politics, taxes, from the point of view of internal regulations of platforms from the point of view of the accountability and transparency of platforms. Anyway, I don't think that small marginal nation states like Italy could address such a question with some perspective of success. A transnational approach is needed, and even the states that are trying to regulate platforms are not small states. They are rather continental states like China, for instance. And China, which is of course kind of strange political animal, let's say, is currently attempting to regulate platforms, to regulate the Chinese platforms. And in a way, at least from some articles I read, China is also raising the question of, let's say, the public appropriation of the wealth generated by the private appropriation of data. But anyway, yes, a transnational approach is our only hope, I think. And David, I completely agree with what you write. I like your reference to the double meaning of free labor. And this is the reason why I was saying that I do not propose to speak of labor, even free labor, to define the social activity that generates data. You know, maybe a better definition, although I am aware that it is quite generic, is social cooperation. It is quite generic, but it has also the problem that the concept of cooperation is usually employed with positive meanings. While I'm speaking of social cooperation here, just in descriptive terms, you know, it's only social interaction could be maybe better, but I like social cooperation more because at least it gives the perspective of kind of political inflection of that social activity. But yes, social cooperation in terms of social interaction. The platform, we heard it from several authors today, intermediates social relations. So it organizes in a way a form of social cooperation.
Yeah, I was thinking of what David was saying. It's like, Portugal would be trabalho é gratuito, so it's for free, and it's voluntário because you do it because you want to. So it's this double meaning. Yes, and I think it's a very interesting observation.
Yeah, but then we need to think, I think, what is voluntary? I mean, we do really there is really such a concept of will involved in WhatsApp or Facebook or Twitter or email or Google. I mean, we can really live completely without it. Or, I mean, yeah, we can go in a forest, but you know, I think the very concept of freedom and will, I mean, that we need probably to be cautious in taking them for granted.
Those are good questions, but I think, at least in my experience, Facebook had several different moments. At least in my experience, there was a moment, I think, for me, it was, I would really much use it to see friends and to talk. It was this moment around 2011, 2012. Well, it also was a moment where I was living abroad and then I moved in. So I think platforms are not always the same. I think you can use it in different ways. And I think
but
different means and
probably what I was pointing to is that probably it's not really, it's a bit like talking about guns, no? I mean, the problem with guns is not that you can decide whether to use them or not. If guns are available, they create a problem, even if you decide not to use them. So, I mean, with platform, we are into this world. So probably it's no longer a matter. Of course, individually, we can have very different paths and decision. But as a society, we cannot really function without all this platform. Of course, without one or two, yeah, maybe. But especially now, we saw now that. And if I can jump to a very quick question to Sandro on this, because I was wondering, during the pandemic, no, what we saw as well was a kind of split within capitalism. Of course, capitalism is not one, it's many, but I'm thinking about, for instance, Italy, in which there was a debate with Confindustria, which is, of course, the organization of industrial companies or industrial owners in Italy. But Confindustria and generally the classic old school capitalism, which was asking very powerfully to keep everything open during the pandemic. Of course, because of course production needed to go on. On the other hand, you would have platform companies, and I'm not talking mostly about Amazon, but also Uber, etc., which would be perfectly happy if everything was closed, because of course. So you see in this context, you see two dimensions of capitalism. One, we can define much more about logistics. It's not that, of course, the other companies don't use logistics, but in a way there is a kind of conflict inside capitalism, or rather a split in interest, which maybe could tell us something about the risk of making the equation capitalism equal logistics equal, you know, every kind of profit seeker, etc., etc. I don't know if you want to comment.
No, it's a very interesting comment, but capitalism is never a unity. It's never a pre-given unity. There are conflicts, even deadly conflicts within the composition of capital, and such conflicts are particularly exacerbated in the current crisis. And it is why we should pay attention at the trends that characterize the crisis, because those trends will have a very important role to play in the articulation of capitalism, in the articulation of the specific capitalist formation that will come out of the crisis. So definitely, you know, speaking of conflicts between fractions of capital, to use the Marxian notion, also refers to questions of hierarchy, questions of power. There are power relations between different capitalist actors. And in the pandemic, such relations are tested, we see which kind of capitalist formation we will be confronted with after the crisis. Although today it seems particularly difficult to imagine an after the pandemic crisis. What is sure is that the trend that we have been discussing yesterday and today regarding logistics and platforms will be further entrenched.
Yes, I do agree. I would just make a comment on something. Yesterday you were speaking about the shift for the whole process of business, and today we are speaking about the entire experience, which is so the entire experience of ordering something, or what produces that. So I think this focus on experience is something very characteristic of this moment and very performative in a way, if we think of it through that lens. So this is just a brief comment, and then I would like to welcome back Franco and to ask Franco if you want to talk about a little bit about Uber in Portugal, because yesterday we mentioned.
So
But so I think it could be
no,
very example.
I had some problem here. I heard everything, but I didn't was available for speaking. But what I would ask to Sandro is already been addressed, which is the question between this possible contradiction between this idea of digital sovereignty on one end, on the other end, this idea of data as a raw material, and maybe it point to a possible historical parallelism, similarities between two epochs. One is the contemporary one, and the other one is the process described well, I think, in a book of Timothy Mitchell, Carbon Democracy, from the passage from carbon to oil energetic system, where companies actually blackmail the states and sabotage also the state in order to affirm their importance and their importance in this transnational energetic system. But, well, I think this question has already been addressed. Maybe I can speak about Uber in Portugal. I mean, I can tell something about that, something which is also terms of a PLUS project coordinated by Professor Mezzadra. And well, maybe something is important to underline about Uber in Portugal, but Uber in general. The link between all the terms that we debated today. First of all, the production of space and its relation with data as raw materials. Of course, when you use Uber accumulate a very large amount of data, and Uber use also these data to negotiate with the political authorities, with municipality relation in order to reshape the urban spaces, the urban transit, and actually Uber in Lisbon, but also in other places in Europe, and especially in other places in the United States. The example of Cincinnati is important in this sense. A properly office of the municipality where the planification of the city is negotiated between Uber and political authorities. Second, the importance of Lisbon on the Uber chain, inside the Uber chain. It means that Lisbon represented a laboratory for Uber. Most of Uber products and most of Uber innovation are first experimented in the United States, then experimented in Lisbon, and then expanded in other European cities. So Lisbon represents an important point in the Uber strategy, in the Uber roots strategy. And of course, there are many other questions, but well, I think these two questions make the link among the themes that we spoke today.
Okay. Maybe for me, it's just not clear the relation with the municipality. So why would the just for make it very clear?
Yes, you're right.
Negotiate
Well,
with Uber.
Uber collect a large amount of data about transit, about public transit, about car transit, about the fluxes of the people moving within the city. And they use these data, their elaboration, to negotiate with the municipality the reshaping of transit fluxes, the renovation of cities. It's clear, this point.
For me, it is very clear. It's a very important point,
So there is this concrete relation between data as raw materials and the capacity that logistic and platform to reorganize spaces and shape spaces.
To reorganize and to govern space.
Yes, exactly. To govern, exactly. Political.
And Uber would make profit out of it. So the municipality would pay Uber for this.
Not necessarily, because Uber also sells their data to other private companies, but especially for governing the city, they make this negotiation. They don't need to sell data to municipality. Mm-hmm. Of course, collecting data is one of the core business of Uber, more than give passenger transport. Collecting data is one of the core
I would like to put that more clear. So that's one of the reasons why Uber sometimes it's so cheap. So just to put it very.
Uber is so cheap for other question also, but I think this relation between data and space is clearly represented by Uber as an instrument to reshape and govern the space, the urban space.
No, I do. So let's just go for why is it so cheap. Maybe if we put all these things, we can understand, make it very clear what are the where does the value comes from. So, for instance, in Uber, I'm just trying to put it very concrete.
On one side, if we look at Uber in the financial market, we find that Uber is not, they're not profit, but they are able to attract funds on the financial market. The profit of Uber, of course, come from data, but of course come from the service that they sell, which is the transport of passengers. Mm-hmm. Okay, but the cost of labor is such cheap because the exploitation, of course.
Of course. Mm-hmm.
Yes, I think that Uber is a good instance of the double source of value I was speaking about before. And moreover, looking at Uber drivers, there is something more to be added, I think, because if you think of a traditional taxi company, kind of industrial taxi company, you are confronted with a quite clear situation. They have, say, 100 drivers who are employed by the company. Okay? Then, if you look at Uber, the situation is completely different because there is an elusive element in the very constitution of the labor force that Uber uses. Actually, Uber can say how many drivers it has available in Lisbon. But Uber's reply is always elusive because there is what we can call the network effect. The real important moment for the operations of Uber with respect to the labor force is the fact that there is a reserve, there is a potential number of drivers, and the potential, the virtual, is crucial in the way in which Uber organizes its relations with its labor force. You know, it's quite different with respect to a traditional taxi company.
Okay, I think I got it. And thank you so much. I think I was trying to bring out these very concrete examples to make it very easy to relate to. So
I think that one of the important points is the point that Mesadra suggested at the beginning of his speech, which is the different kind of platform that Srinchek talks about. This idea of lean platform, which Uber represents really well, because the only investment of Uber is on algorithm, which generate a platform to create this encounter between who offer the service and who buy the service. So this idea of potential worker is exactly that. With this platform, Uber call all of one want to sell their works on this platform, but they don't have an investment on fixed capital. Uber doesn't own cars, for example. They all invested on algorithm and few workers that works in their center. For example, another example, the European Center for Uber is in Lisbon. The European Center of Development in Lisbon.
I didn't know that. But I like this opposition between actual labor force and the potential labor force.
Thank you so much. Maybe one more question. I know it's late and it's our second day in a row.
Let me just add this thing that all these questions regarding Uber and Lisbon are writing an article that as Plus we published in Le Monde Diplomatique in November 2009, I guess.
I don't remember. Well, maybe one last someone.
Yeah.
Well,
I don't know if we can finish with the usual speculation. Just three concepts, and you, Sandro, tell me what you think about them, and if you want to use them together or separately. One is the concept of logisticality, which is developed by Stefano Harning, which is a kind of a way to think a way to think social cooperation and a way of interaction which kind of precedes logistic and then is appropriated by logistic, whatever. And the other concept is accelerationism. So you mentioned Nick Strycek and Benjamin Bratton, which both are in different ways towards this kind of understanding, which of course it's really about using technology and platform, et cetera. And the third is basic income. So if you want to comment on these three concepts, or you to shuffle them together, and what do you think about them?
Well, actually, I like the notion of logisticality, although there is a tendency to forge new word notion around logistics that sometimes is kind of, let's say, uncanny. But logisticality, as it is developed by Stefano Harning and Fred Moten, is a very helpful concept, precisely because it points, let's say, to the materiality of logistics and to the intertwining of different processes in such materiality. You know, my point, my old point of discussion with Stefano and Fred, has to do with the question of subjectivity, because emphasizing the link between the origin of modern logistics and the Middle Passage, they basically contend that logistics' aim is to erase subjectivity. And my answer is that this erasure can never be complete, can never be accomplished. There is always a moment of subjectivity in logisticality. Accelerationism would require some more time. I understand the relevance of that approach. Sometimes my impression is that it nurtures a kind of a critical celebration of technology and in particular platforms. So we would need more time to discuss that, but also in a way the relationship between accelerationism and the new Labour Party in the UK. And basic income, you know, in Italy we have been discussing about basic income. We have been organizing around the topic of basic income since the early 1990s. I think it is a very important issue, and it can become even more important in the pandemic crisis. It is very important to think of basic income not in terms of benefits, but in terms of redistribution of wealth. And with respect to platform capitalism, I was saying that we are confronted here with a double source of capital valorization. And the second one, the one linked with data, is also linked, let's say, with the commons. I was saying before, with social cooperation producing the commons. Well, I think that such a notion of double source of value is not valid only with respect to platform capitalism, but also with respect to other branches of capital operations. And it is precisely the relevance of this dimension of social cooperation, the relevance of the common in this sense, that we have to take as a foundation for our theories of basic income, and particularly for our struggles for basic income.
Well, thank you. I think it's a very good way of ending with this idea of, with this discussion on basic income, not in terms of benefits, but in terms of redistribution of wealth produced by social cooperation. I think this is very, it's a good way.
Happy to hear that. I'm happy to hear that.
Yes, no, I think it's a good way to put it, because it's a very important and urgent question we all need to have. I mean, in culture is very, very, it's evident, but all over. And I will thank you so much.
Thank you.
Sandro, and I will thank you all for being here, and let's hope that next time you can be really in Lisbon.
Yes, let's hope that. I mean,
Well,
io direi-
thank you so much. Thank you so much for
Bye
this.
bye, ciao a tutti.
Bye bye.
Ciao, ciao, ci vediamo
Ciao.
presto.
Much.
A presto, ciao.